Geelong is a city built twice. The first time in the 1830s on wool, bales of it, pressed and stacked on the shore of a bay 75 kilometres from Melbourne, waiting for ships bound for England. The second time, beginning in 1925, when the Ford Motor Company made Geelong the headquarters of its Australian operations, and Geelong went on to make Ford engines for the better part of a century. In 2013, Ford announced it would leave. The forecasts that followed were the forecasts every industrial town receives at the end of its industry. Population drain, boarded shop fronts, a local economy hollowed out by the closure of the one employer whole streets, whole families had been built around. Geelong was expected to join the list of places an industry outgrows and abandons. It did not. Corio Bay is an arm of Port Phillip, folded into the coast of Victoria about 75 kilometres southwest of Melbourne. It is deep water, close to shore, sheltered, easy to enter under sail, the kind of harbour that gets used long before it gets named, and used again long after the reasons for naming it have changed. In 1838, 3 weeks after Melbourne itself was surveyed, government surveyors came to Corio Bay and measured out a town on its northern shore. They did not know, and had no way of knowing, which of the two settlements would end up mattering more. That was not the surveyor's question. The surveyor's question was whether the water was deep enough, and it was. The town was gazetted on October 10th, 1838. By the end of that year, it held about 545 people, a church, a hotel, a store, a wool store, and 82 houses. Not a city, not yet an ambition in the sense that word would later be used, a landing, a warehouse, and a congregation. The minimum architecture required to take wool off a continent and put it on a ship. The wool store came first for a reason that had nothing to do with Geelong itself. Inland and to the west lay the grasslands of the Western District, country already carrying sheep in numbers. The colony was still in the process of counting. Wool, unlike almost anything else the district could produce, did not spoil on a 4-month voyage. It did not need to be sold quickly, or eaten fresh, or kept cool. It could be pressed into a bale, stacked in a dry store, and left to wait for a ship, a market, and a price that might not be known for the better part of a year. Geelong's only qualification in 1838 was that it sat between the sheep and the sea, with water deep enough to take the ships that would carry the one to the other. And then, very quietly, in 1841, the first wool from the district was shipped directly to England. It travelled by sail, at the pace sail allowed, and the men who had grown it and pressed it and stored it would not learn its price in Yorkshire until long after it had left their hands, until a return letter had crossed the same distance the wool itself had crossed going the other way. This was not commerce conducted at speed. It was commerce conducted at the speed of patience, and Geelong's entire function in its first years was to make that patience possible, to be the fixed point on a colonial map onto which a distant and slow-moving market could be pegged. It was a port before it was a town. It was a town before it was a market. And it was a market before it occurred to anyone, in London or in the colony, to think of it as a city. The wool store did not care what grew up around it, so long as what grew up around it kept the bales dry and the wharves clear. A church, for the people who had come to run the store. A hotel, for the people who had come to sell to the people who ran the store. A store, in the plainest sense of the word, for everything the port itself would need before the ships arrived and after they left. By the early 1840s, Geelong's identity was fixed in a way its size was not. It was where the wool of the Western District stopped being a paddock's worth of sheep and became a shipment, a bill of lading, a commodity bound for mills 8 months distant. The town would grow and change and eventually outgrow every memory of how small its beginnings were. But its function did not change for decades. Ships arrived empty and left low in the water, weighed down with bales pressed so tight they held their shape for the length of an ocean. On the wharf at Corio Bay, in the closing weeks of 1838, that was the entire enterprise. 82 houses, 1 store of wool, and a bay deep enough to carry it away. Gold does not have to be found in a place to change it. In 1851, it was found at nearby Ballarat, inland from the bay, and Geelong, the nearest deep water port to the goldfields, became the antechamber to a rush it did not own and had not asked for. Every ship of diggers, every crate of mining equipment, every letter sent home with news of a find or a failure came in through Corio Bay first. The town built to move wool out to the world found itself, without any change in its own ambitions, moving the entire colony's hope inland instead. The population answered accordingly. By the mid-1850s, Geelong held about 23,000 people, a 40-fold increase inside a single generation, achieved not by anything Geelong manufactured or grew, but by the plain fact of standing between a port and a goldfield. Wharves built to load wool were pressed into unloading picks and tents and provisions for men who had no intention of staying. A hospital opened in 1852, built for a town that had already outgrown the medical assumptions of a decade earlier. A railway to Melbourne was completed in 1857, laid this time not for wool but for the ordinary restless traffic of a boomtown no longer served by dray and coastal steamer alone. Gold receded, as gold rushes do. The fields at Ballarat and elsewhere thinned, the easy alluvial finds gave out, and the diggers who had passed through Geelong on their way inland did not, for the most part, pass back through it on their way to anywhere else. What Geelong kept was not the gold. It was the infrastructure the gold had paid for, the hospital, the railway, the wharves rebuilt to handle a decade of unprecedented traffic, and a population 3 times the size the wool trade alone had ever required. Now needing employment, the wool trade alone could not supply. That gap is where the manufacturing city began to take shape. And then, very quietly, in 1868, Victoria's first woolen mill was established at South Geelong. It was a small pivot, in the way that matters most. Not a rejection of the wool port Geelong had been, but an argument that wool did not have to leave the colony raw. For 30 years, Geelong had shipped bales to England and waited for Yorkshire to turn them into cloth. The mill at South Geelong proposed in brick and machinery, rather than in words, that some of that work could be done at the source, that a place which grew the raw material and controlled the port did not have to send the whole of the value away with the ship. This was not a large claim in 1868. One mill does not make a manufacturing city, but it set a precedent the following decades would build on. Mills, then more mills, then the assorted trades that grow up around a mill town in the way hotels once grew up around a wool store, dyers, weavers, machinists, the whole secondary economy that a raw commodity does not require but a processed one does. Geelong was becoming a place that made things, and not only a place that shipped them. The civic recognition of that shift arrived slowly, as civic recognition does. Geelong was declared a city on the 8th of December 1910, 72 years after its gazettal as a town, by which time it had long since stopped resembling the settlement of 1838 in anything but name and location. The 82 houses had become suburbs. The single wool store had become a district of mills, wharves, and workshops along the Barwon River and the shore of the bay. By 1936, it had overtaken Ballarat, the very goldfield whose rush had first swollen its population to become Victoria's second largest city after Melbourne alone. By then, Geelong was, in every particular but one, an industrial city. It had a port, a railway, a hospital, a rank of mills along the Barwon, and a civic status to match. It shipped wool and it wove wool, and had done both for the better part of a century. The one thing it did not yet make in 1936 was an engine. On 31st March 1925, the Ford Motor Company announced that Geelong would be the headquarters of its Australian operations. Ford did not choose Geelong for its wool, or its mills, or its civic standing as Victoria's second city. It chose a port. The same virtue that had built the town in 1838 was the virtue that built it again in 1925. Deep water close to shore, capable of bringing in components and sending out finished vehicles, in a state that had spent nearly 90 years perfecting the business of moving cargo through Corio Bay. By 1925, that virtue was no longer rare in itself. Plenty of Australian towns sat on water. What Geelong offered in addition was everything the port had accumulated around it since 1838. A railway already threaded to Melbourne, a workforce already disciplined by 3 generations of mill and wharf labour, a civic apparatus built to accommodate a large sudden employer because it had done exactly that once before in 1851, when gold, rather than an American car company, had been the disruption. Ford did not build Geelong's readiness. It inherited it. Assembly began that July, 4 months after the announcement, and it began in a converted wool store. Nobody involved is on record as having remarked on it at the time, and there is no reason to think anyone did. A wool store, by 1925, was simply the largest, dry, serviceable industrial building Geelong had to offer on short notice, and Ford needed a roof, not a symbol. But the fact remains, plain and unembellished, that the first Ford vehicles assembled in Geelong took shape inside a building raised to hold the bales that had made the town in the first place. Cars began where wool had been stored. The building did not know the difference and did not need to. And then, very quietly, a purpose-built factory rose at Norlane on the northern edge of the town, and assembly shifted there as the works came online. This was not a conversion, but a construction. A factory designed from its footings upward for the specific work of building motor vehicles, in a way the wool store, however useful in the interim, had never been designed for anything but wool. In the years that followed, the Geelong plant settled into a particular role within Ford's Australian operations. Not the final assembly of every vehicle sold under the name, but the engine and stamping work. The block, the panel, the pressed steel that other plants would receive and finish into cars. Geelong made the parts, other places turned into product. There is a version of this story that leans on the coincidence of wool store and assembly line that treats the wool store as an omen, visible only in hindsight, of everything the plant would become. That version overstates what happened. Nothing about a converted warehouse determined what would happen in it over the decades that followed. What determined it was a port, a railway, a workforce already accustomed to the discipline of factory labour by 3 generations of milling wool, and a company willing to build where those conditions already existed. The wool store was convenience, not prophecy. It is worth noting and worth leaving at that. What can be said without overreaching is that Geelong had by 1925 become a difficult place for a large employer to avoid. It happened to be Ford. It happened to be engines and stamped steel rather than some other manufactured good. But the underlying fact that Geelong had spent 87 years building the exact conditions a large industrial employer requires was not an accident of 1925. It was the accumulated consequence of 1838, 1851, and 1868 alike. By the time the Norlane Works reached full operation, Geelong had acquired the industry that would define it for the remainder of the 20th century, laid over the industries that had defined the century before it. It was still a wool port. It was still a mill town, in the sense that the mills built after 1868 had never closed. It was now, in addition, a car town, and of the 3 identities the city had assembled since 1838, this newest one would prove the loudest, the one visitors named first, the one whole suburbs would be built to house the workers of. It would also, though no one at Norlane in 1925 had reason to suspect it, be the one the city would eventually have to learn how to live without. By the middle of the 20th century, Geelong is no longer a city with a car plant in it. It is a car plant with a city built around it, and a wool port under that, and a mill town under that, 3 earlier versions of itself still running in the same streets as the 4th. At Norlane, Ford's engine and stamping sheds run in shifts, day and night, pressing panels and casting blocks for cars sold from Perth to Townsville. On the shore of Corio Bay, from 1962, Alcoa opens a smelter at Point Henry, turning alumina into ingot in furnaces that never go cold, adding a second heavy industry to a waterfront that has carried wool bales and flour sacks for over a century. Inland from the bay, the woolen mills still take fleece off the same rail lines that once fed the old bond stores. A fertilizer works turns out superphosphate for the districts that grow the wheat and run the sheep that started the whole enterprise 100 years earlier. A rope and cordage works twists fibre into cable. At Corio, a distillery lays down whiskey in a warehouse that will still be standing and still working, long after some of what surrounds it has gone quiet. The port itself does not need reinventing so much as reloading. Wharves built to move wool bales now move bauxite in and ingot out, the same cranes doing different work for a different century. Not one industry, but 4. Not one employer, but a rotation of them, wide enough that a family can lose a job at the mill and find one at the smelter without leaving the same 3 streets. Not a boomtown, but something steadier and less remarked upon. A working city, fully employed, that has stopped needing to explain itself. It is the kind of city where a man can leave school at 14 or 15, walk into a factory gate, and reasonably expect to retire from the same industry, if not the same employer, 40-odd years later. By 1966, the census confirms what the pay packets already show. Geelong's population passes 105,000, and it is Victoria's second largest city, behind only Melbourne, ahead of every other provincial town in the state. The suburbs radiating out from Norlane and Point Henry are built to a pattern familiar to industrial cities anywhere in the world. Modest houses close to the factory gate, filled with families whose fathers, and increasingly whose sons, work the same shifts their fathers worked. Saturdays belong to the football club, which draws its rivalries and its loyalties from the same streets that empty into the same factories on Monday. The city's wages, its housing stock, its junior football leagues, its hotels, and its unions are all, in the end, downstream of the same fact. Geelong makes things, and the things it makes are sold somewhere else. Ask anyone in the city in 1966 what Geelong is for, and the answer comes back in the same 3 or 4 nouns: wool, engines, ingot, cloth. No one answers with a service or an idea or a view. In 1974, the state opens a university at Warn Ponds on the city's edge and calls it Deakin. It is a small addition to a city organised almost entirely around manual and semi-skilled labour, a single new institution in a place that has, until now, measured its worth in tons of ingot and dozens of engines rather than in degrees conferred. Nobody in 1974 has particular reason to notice that the university will still be growing decades after the smelter and the stamping plant are gone. It arrives quietly, alongside everything else, one more thing the city has added to itself rather than a sign of anything about to be subtracted. The Geelong of this period assumes, reasonably on the evidence available to it, that it will always make things. The evidence is everywhere, in the smoke over Point Henry, in the whistle at shift change at Norlane, in the fleece trucks still queuing at the mill gates, in a population curve that has only ever gone one direction since 1838. Nothing in the record of the preceding 128 years suggests otherwise. What the city cannot see in 1966 is the balance sheet, not the one it keeps, the ledgers of wages paid and wool washed and ingot cast, all of which are healthy, but the one being kept elsewhere, in Detroit and Canberra and Pittsburgh, weighing what it costs to make an engine in Geelong against what it costs to make the same engine somewhere else. That ledger is not yet unfavourable. In 1966, nobody has any reason to open it. No single date marks the start of it. That is the nature of a structural decline. It has no equivalent of a ribbon cutting, no crowd, no photograph. It arrives instead as a sequence of numbers, adjusted downward in Canberra, a % here and a % there, spread across a decade, each adjustment defensible on its own terms, and none of them, individually, sufficient to close a plant. Through the 1980s, successive governments reduced the tariff protection that has sheltered Australian car manufacturing since before Ford ever built a stamping shed at Norlane. The logic is not local, it is the same logic being applied in the same years to manufacturing industries across the developed world. That a market closed to competition is a market that never has to become efficient, and that a market forced open will, eventually, sort its producers into those who can compete globally and those who cannot. Australia, with a population smaller than metropolitan Los Angeles supporting several competing car manufacturers, building several competing models, has never been an obvious candidate for the first category. Protection had made that arrangement possible for decades. Removing it in careful stages through the 1980s and into the 1990s does not immediately close anything. It simply removes the reason the arrangement made sense. The car industry itself is changing shape at the same time for reasons that have nothing to do with Geelong. Manufacturers that once built cars largely for their home market begin building them for the world, consolidating models across countries, moving production to wherever it is cheapest to locate it. A car built in Thailand or South Korea can be shipped to Melbourne for less than it costs to press the same panels at Norlane. This is not a judgment on the panels or on the men and women pressing them. It is arithmetic, performed in a currency that does not care where the factory stands. Then there is the dollar. For much of the industry's later life, the Australian dollar trades at a level that makes Australian-built goods difficult to sell overseas and imported goods cheap to buy at home. A mineral boom elsewhere in the country, pushing up the currency and pricing the car plants, the mills, and the smelter out of the very markets they were built to supply. A city on Corio Bay finds its wages set, in effect, by the price of iron ore dug out of the ground 2,000 kilometres away. Nobody at Norlane digs iron ore, ships it, or prices it. The plant simply lives, or does not, by the number that results. None of this has a face. There is no single decision, no single minister, no single executive in Detroit or Melbourne who can be said to have done it. There is only an accumulation, a tariff schedule revised in 1 year, a currency that will not sit still, a global industry reorganizing its supply chains around wherever labor and logistics are cheapest, and a local market too small on its own to change any of those facts by wanting to. What makes the 1980s and the 1990s and the 2000s difficult to narrate is that from the street, Geelong does not look like a city in decline. The Norlane plant still runs. The Alcoa smelter still runs. The mills contract one by one, but slowly enough that no single closure reads as a turning point. The football club still plays on Saturdays. The population keeps climbing on the strength of Melbourne's overspill and the university at Warren Ponds, even as the industries that built the city's identity produce less, employ fewer, and matter less to what the city actually is. It is a long squeeze rather than a single blow, which is precisely what makes it survivable, decade after decade, without ever being solved. Each year the arithmetic gets slightly worse. Each year, the plant that loses money is not yet the plant that closes. The gap between the two is filled, for a while, by scale, by subsidy, by a workforce willing to accept what an unprotected market will not otherwise pay it, and by the simple fact that closing an 80-year-old engine plant is a decision large enough that no one wants to be the one who makes it a year before they have to. By the early 2000s, the ledger that nobody thought to open in 1966 has been open and read for 30 years. It has not yet been acted on. It is simply sitting there in Detroit, getting worse. On the 23rd of May 2013 in Melbourne, Ford tells its Australian workforce that it will stop making cars in this country. Not scale back, not restructure, stop. After 88 years, from the day in 1925 when the company first opened its doors on this side of the world, Ford Australia will manufacture nothing at all. The reasoning offered is the ledger, finally read aloud. For the 2012 financial year, Ford Australia has recorded a loss of about $141 million after tax. Sales of Australian-built cars have fallen for years against imports built more cheaply elsewhere. The dollar remains high. The costs of building an engine or a Falcon in Geelong or Broadmeadows, measured against the costs of building the equivalent somewhere else, no longer makes sense to anyone whose job it is to make that comparison. The company states it plainly, in the flat language companies use for decisions of this size. Manufacturing in Australia is no longer viable. There is no accusation in the statement, and no apology either. It is closer to a coroner's finding than a confession. A cause of death established after the fact for something not yet dead. About 1,200 jobs are named directly. Workers at the Norlane plant in Geelong and at the sister plant in Broadmeadows on the northern edge of Melbourne, where Ford has built cars since even before the Geelong operation existed. The number does not include the parts suppliers, the contractors, and the small businesses in Geelong's northern suburbs, whose customers are disproportionately people who work at the plant. It does not need to. Everyone in the city can do that arithmetic without being told. Not one job, but a chain of them. Not one wage, but every wage that depends on that wage being spent locally. Not one plant, but a district built house by house and shop by shop on the assumption that the plant would keep paying it. The closure is not immediate. Ford sets a date, 2016. Between the announcement and the closure lie 3 years, 3 years in which the plant keeps running, the engines keep coming off the line, the workers keep clocking in, and the date sits ahead of all of it like a hearing already scheduled. A factory does not usually know its own closing date 3 years in advance. Geelong's does. It will keep making cars, keep casting engine blocks, keep meeting its production targets for 3 more years, under a sentence already handed down and merely waiting on its execution. The announcement does not arrive in isolation. The month before, in April 2013, Shell announces it will close the oil refinery at Corio. A second heavy industry, on a second stretch of the same waterfront, reaching a version of the same conclusion at close to the same time, for reasons that are its own, but that rhyme unmistakably with Ford's. Two of the pillars that have supported Geelong's identity as an industrial city within a matter of weeks of each other tell the city that they are leaving. Neither company frames it as connected to the other. The city, reading both announcements in the same season, is not required to believe they are unconnected. There is no single moment in 2013 when the plant goes quiet. The last engine has not yet come off the line. The last worker has not yet clocked out for the last time. What exists instead is a countdown, a known number of years, an unusually precise form of foreknowledge for a city to be handed, and unusually little to do with it. The mortgages already taken out against a wage from Norlane do not become due any sooner. The children already enrolled in Geelong schools do not finish any faster. The 3 years simply have to be lived at the ordinary pace of an ordinary working week inside a plant that is now officially temporary. At Norlane, on the afternoon of 23rd May 2013, the stamping presses do not pause. The shift due to start at 3 o'clock starts at 3 o'clock. The engine blocks keep moving down the line, cast, bored, fitted, and packed for dispatch, exactly as they were the day before the announcement, and exactly as they will be, largely unchanged, for most of the 3 years still to come. It is possible that afternoon to stand on the factory floor at Norlane and watch a machine that has been told, precisely, the date on which it will stop, and see it doing, for now, exactly what it has always done. The closures arrive on schedule, which is its own kind of arithmetic. A city can be told a date 3 years in advance and still not be ready for it, because grief does not observe deadlines even when factories do. Alcoa goes first. The aluminium smelter at Point Henry on the northern curve of Corio Bay had run since 1962, converting imported alumina into ingot with the same appetite for cheap power that had drawn industry to Geelong for a century. In 2014 it stops. About 980 people lose their jobs directly. Some counts run closer to 1,000, and the flow-on loss through the contractors, the transport firms, and the smaller fabricators that existed only because the smelter existed is estimated at some 3,000 more. The reasons are given in the language of exchange rates and commodity cycles. An Australian dollar too high for too long, a world price of aluminium too low to absorb the cost of making it here. The arithmetic is not disputed by anyone. It never is. Understanding why a plant closes has never been the same thing as being able to stop it. Then, Ford keeps its date. On 26 September 2016, the engine and stamping plant at Norlane produces its last Australian-made engine, a 4-cylinder unit for a car the company will from now on import rather than build. 91 years end that afternoon, not in a speech but in a production log. The final unit rolling off a line that had once run 3 shifts without pause. 11 days later, on 7th October 2016, the assembly plant at Broadmeadows in Melbourne closes as well, and the sentence that opened in Geelong in 1925 closes with it. Ford Australia manufactured cars for 91 years. Then it did not. Target follows, quieter than either. The retailer had kept its head office in Geelong for decades, a white-collar counterweight to the factory floors, proof that the city held more than blue overalls. Around 2016, the head office moves toward Melbourne, and with it goes a class of job the smelter and the engine plant had never employed in the first place. The accountants, the buyers, the merchandising staff who had never worn a hard hat, and now had no office to walk into. By the low point, unemployment in Geelong's northern suburbs, Norlane, Corio, the streets built for Ford's own workforce in the 1950s, runs near 10%. It is not the whole city's number. The northern suburbs carry it disproportionately, the way they had carried the jobs disproportionately, built as they were around a single employer's rosters. A forecast made in the 1970s, revised through the 1990s, restated in 2013, had said that a city this dependent on manufacturing would not survive its manufacturers. For a period after October 2016, the forecast looks correct. The smelter is silent. The engine plant is silent. The department store's paperwork has gone to another city. The unemployment figures are published quarter after quarter, and they do not fall quickly. Nothing about this is unusual, which is the point. Rust belts elsewhere had followed the same sequence: announcement, interval, closure, an unemployment number that climbs before it falls, if it falls. Geelong differs from Youngstown or Flint in no way that is visible in 2016. The mills are quiet. The wool stores have been quiet for decades already. Now the car plant and the smelter join them, and a visitor driving along the Princes Highway past Norlane in that year would see what a rust belt is supposed to look like. Shuttered gates, empty car parks sized for shifts that no longer exist, and a bay that once loaded wool and unloaded alumina, now carrying neither. The forecast does not come true, not immediately and not without cost to the people it had already cost. But the city does not become what Youngstown became, or what the mining towns of the Western Australian interior become when the ore runs out and the population leaves with it. Geelong reorganises instead. The reorganisation had, in fact, begun before the closures did. In 2006, the Victorian government announces that the Transport Accident Commission, the statutory body that insures every registered vehicle in the state, will move its head office to Geelong. The new headquarters is completed in 2008 at a cost of $80 million on the old waterfront, and it brings with it about 850 jobs, public sector jobs, salaried, permanent, requiring none of the physical wear a smelter or an assembly line requires. WorkSafe Victoria, the state's workplace insurance authority, follows the same logic and bases itself in Geelong as well. Two large insurers, publicly owned, now sit where wool brokers once sat. More follows through the 2000s and 10s. The National Disability Insurance Agency, established to run Australia's National Disability Insurance Scheme, headquarters itself in Geelong, a federal institution this time, choosing the same city the state had already bet on. Deakin University, founded in 1974, expands its waterfront campus into glass and water frontage that had once belonged to wool stores and slipways, and becomes one of the city's largest employers in its own right. Barwon Health, the regional public hospital network, grows into another. None of these institutions replaces the smelter job for job, or the worker for the worker who held it. A furnace operator at Point Henry does not become a claims assessor at the Transport Accident Commission by force of the city needing him to. The jobs that arrive are not the jobs that left, and for a portion of Geelong's manufacturing workforce, the two never meet. But the city's population does not read like a city in decline. It had stood at about 105,000 in 1966, when the mills and the Ford plant were still near their peak. By 2020, it is about 282,000, among the fastest growing municipal populations in Australia, growing through the very years the smelter and the car plant went dark. People are not leaving Geelong. They are arriving, for reasons that have less to do with manufacturing than with proximity. An hour from Melbourne, a waterfront being remade, housing cheaper than the capitals. The old wool store precinct along the Moorabool and the Bay is redeveloped into apartments, offices, and the university campus itself. The industrial waterfront becomes a residential and institutional one. None of this undoes what closed. It runs alongside it. An insurance agency job in a new headquarters building does not repair the trade a smelter worker learned over 20 years. And the unemployment that concentrated in the northern suburbs in 2016 does not evaporate because a government department opens an office on the other side of town. What can be said without inflating it is only this: the city as a whole did not contract to match its lost industries. It found other reasons to exist. in government, insurance, health, and higher education, and grew through them at the same time its manufacturing base was disappearing. Ford left Geelong. Geelong did not leave with it. By 2020, Geelong has outlived two industries that were each, in their own era, called the reason the city existed. Wool built it in 1838, and then wool receded, and the city did not end. Cars remade it in 1925, and then cars receded, and the city did not end that time either. Twice, an industry that was assumed to be permanent proved not to be, and twice the assumption turned out to matter less than the place itself. The old sites are still there doing other work. The wool stores along the Moorabool, built of bluestone in the 1860s to hold bales waiting for the London auctions, now hold apartments, offices, a gallery, a university faculty. The Ford stamping plant at Norlane does not vanish from the map. Parts of the industrial estate around it are repurposed, leased, subdivided, the way industrial land always eventually is, standing half-used in the years immediately after 2016, the way any recently vacated shed stands half-used before someone finds a reason for it. Point Henry, where the smelter ran for 52 years, is handed to remediation and redevelopment, its future undecided in any way that can yet be verified. None of these sites has been demolished into vacant lots and left that way, which is the plainest evidence available that the ghost town forecast did not arrive. That outcome was not guaranteed. Youngstown, Ohio, did not recover from the loss of its steel mills in anything like the way Geelong recovered from the loss of its wool trade and its car plant. Its population is still, decades later, a fraction of what it was. The gold towns of Victoria's own interior, Steiglitz near Geelong itself, among the smallest of them, did simply empty out when the reef gold ran thin, and are ghost towns now in the literal sense, a few walls and a cemetery. Geelong is not those towns. It has a natural harbour, a location an hour from a capital city, and by the accident of geography and government decision, a sequence of institutions willing to relocate their headquarters there when the manufacturing did not survive. Take away any one of those advantages, the port, the distance from Melbourne, the Transport Accident Commission's decision in 2006, and the outcome is not obviously the same. The forecasts of a dead city were wrong, but they were not wrong because the city was owed a different ending. They were wrong because enough of the specific contingent things that keep a city alive happened to be present, and because enough people who had worked at the smelter and the engine plant found other work elsewhere in time, at whatever cost that took them individually to bear. Stand today where the wool clippers once loaded and the car carriers once left, on the Corio Bay waterfront below the old stores. The water still meets the same shoreline it met in 1838. On one side, the bluestone wool stores stand refitted with new windows, university signage, apartment balconies facing the bay. On the other, out past the breakwater, the shipping channel that once carried bales to London and alumina in from Queensland, and cars out to the rest of the country, still runs open to the sea, and a ship still, some mornings, moves along it, low in the water, going somewhere else, carrying something else, the way ships going somewhere else have moved along that channel for almost 200 years.